Finishing Tomorrow Never Dies was a surprising experience that I ended up enjoying more than GoldenEye, and here's why. But first, a little backstory. Tomorrow Never Dies was my first Bond movie, and don't tell anyone, but to this day I think it's top 5 easily. It was the one that made me fall in love with the franchise, and unlike GoldenEye, I had the game as a kid for a change. But since I never owned a memory card, and my 8-year-old brain couldn't make heads or tails of the maze that was the penultimate level, more on that later, I never did get to finish it, even after countless tries. So, coming back to it after all this time, I was hopeful that I could accomplish a childhood ambition and finally finish it. And look, I know calling it an ambition is kind of sad and dramatic, but it was either this or becoming the first Black Latino Bond. So I'll take what I can get. Also, I was hopeful that I could recapture some of the endless enjoyment I had with this during what could have only been hundreds of playthroughs as a kid. As I started, I was reminded of just how much I love the aesthetics of this particular Bond period. The Broso Middle Ages, as I'll be referring to from now on, which encompasses his middle two movies, Tomorrow Never Dies and The World Is Not Enough. The metallic phone logo, the title over red strokes, the 90s techno soundtrack, the fire, the BMW, the Walter PPK, the ice-cold Brosnan look, it's all just so freaking awesome. Another thing that also hit me like a tidal wave was the PS1 startup sound. Hearing it for the first time in 20 years took me right back to my childhood room, swapping this between this and the first Spider-Man game by Activision whenever I got stuck in either one.
Tommy Tellerico Studios.
Wait, what? Right off the bat, something that didn't age well, huh? Coming into the game proper, it's blatant just how much they took from Rare's GoldenEye, presentation-wise. But outside of that, EA really went for a completely different approach in ditching the first-person view and going third-person. You could say that they were trying to avoid direct comparisons, but then the fact that they're so similar in presentation throws that idea out the window. Another weird decision is keeping the N64 and going with PS1 exclusively. Yes, the PS1 had a much larger player base, but not taking advantage of the massive impact of GoldenEye is a bizarre business decision in hindsight. Being a third-person shooter is not only a big change from the last game, but also a genre the Bond games have only come back to twice so far. Mostly sticking to the tried and true formula of GoldenEye and Call of Duty clones. Maybe the reception to this one scared off EA from trying this approach more, despite the fact that it fits the franchise a lot better. I definitely think that a character like Bond, who is defined by his suaveness and overall being the coolest guy in every room, translates a lot better to the screen when you're actually able to see him. Besides the choice of genre, the mission structure is probably the most interesting thing about it. Each of the 10 missions available expands on sequences from the movie in interesting ways, and it even adds a few new ones seemingly out of nowhere. This is actually a result of a major change during development. See, the game was originally supposed to be a continuation of the movie with the subtitle The Mission Continues, which explains the extra sequences and expanded roles for minor characters like Satoshi Sagura, the car chase taking place in an entirely different location, and big changes like Bond rescuing Paris Carver from being killed.
Are you alright, Paris?
I think so.
We need to get out of here. Come on, follow me.
Which completely negates the most emotional scene of the movie. One can only assume this was a different character before it was retooled as a more straightforward adaptation.
Look, I'm just testing this highly explosive top-secret Tomorrow Never Dies video game for PlayStation. The game starts where Tomorrow Never Dies ends and challenges you to think, act and behave, well, possibly not behave, like James Bond. I must say, it's lethal.
That this was a last-minute change imposed by EA is all too clear from the start of the first mission. An original set piece taking place in a snowy military base, very similar to the first level in GoldenEye, that is not in the movie but is adjusted to take place just before the opening title sequence. I can't imagine how someone coming off of playing GoldenEye might have felt back then. I'm sure the third-person action style was an unwelcome shock, especially after all the similarities in presentation. But even now, for me, after playing and kind of loathing GoldenEye, right off the bat, Tomorrow Never Dies gives a terrible first impression. The draw distance is awful, somehow Bond looks more like a cardboard cutout than in GoldenEye, and good god the tank controls. I had completely forgotten that this was released right before the analog stick controls were the standard for action games on PlayStation. So this controls like the first Resident Evil, except it's not a fixed camera angle, and the gameplay strives for faster third-person action that the controls can't keep up with. The way the shooting works is through an auto-aim mechanic that attaches to the enemy that's closest while the player mindlessly presses the X button over and over to shoot. A couple of things immediately stand out. The first is that you can't change the enemy you are targeting at any given moment, unless you slowly turn to face them, which I can give a pass to because C-targeting was a very novel concept at the time, but it still feels awkward. The second is that there's no reload button, which seems like such an essential element to a shooter that not having it feels like a giant mistake on the developer's part. Two mechanics are supposed to alleviate the tank controls. There's a button that automatically turns you towards the closest enemy, but it doesn't work well when there are multiple enemies surrounding you. And it happens to be the same button for actions such as opening doors or activating computers, so this leads to very frustrating mistakes every once in a while. It's also very slow, so you are already 3 life bars down by the time you're facing an enemy. Bond can also strafe by using the back triggers, but the aiming doesn't stick to the enemy when doing so it's only ever really useful in boss battles when dodging their special attacks. And oh yeah, there are boss battles here. A handful of times during the campaign, one of the main baddies from the movie shows up as a boss.
Seems to me the only thing ending is your life. Sayonara.
They are essentially the same as regular enemies, except they have special projectile weapons and are more of a bullet sponge than usual. Unfortunately, they don't add much variety to the overall gameplay, which is disappointing because after all the negative first impressions, the first 2 levels leave a promise of a game with a few aces up its sleeve. The first one ends with a ski chase right out of The Spy Who Loves Me, down to the Union Jack parachute that, while suffering from terrible slowdown, is actually very fun. Meanwhile, the second level requires finding and photographing different objectives. Your typical spy stuff, then jumping into the cockpit of a jet and shooting up an Arms Bazaar before taking off into a low-quality version of the title sequence from the movie that endearingly replaces the movie credits with the development staff. And wait, Chad Stahelski was the stunt director for this, as in Chad Stahelski, the director of the John Wick franchise. Man, this game is full of surprises. Not in the game though, Pierce Brosnan, or anyone from the cast for that matter, most of whom provide their likeness but not their voice talent. But look, I'd be lying if I said the low quality sound alikes don't add a so bad it's good energy to every cutscene. They are charming in a Resident Evil 1 type way. Every character jumps from one line to the next like they skip several pieces of context from the middle, and yet everyone follows the conversation with seemingly no issue.
Paris, someone in your husband's organization was involved in the sinking of the Devonshire and the murder of those British sailors. You don't know anything about that, do you?
Elliot's company is involved in many things, James. I don't keep track of them all.
Look, I'm sorry what happened between us, but I need your help.
Well, I know there's a restricted lab.
Ah, Mr. Bond. Won't you allow me to give you a tour of the facilities?
I'd be interested to find out if someone not familiar with the plot of the movie could follow all this nonsense. More issues compound as the game progresses. By the 3rd level, it's a been there, done that affair, only throwing more enemies at you, and as the amount increases, the more the auto-aim does whatever it wants. This is not helped by the fact that, like I mentioned, the draw distance is terrible. You can barely see what's directly ahead of you. Definitely not ideal when enemies can shoot you from miles away and regularly hide in camera blind spots to surprise you. As you can probably imagine, this combined with the tank controls leads to one frustrating moment after another. They do make the effort to add some variety by squeezing a vehicle level there, but it's very linear, and the shooting from the vehicle doesn't feel as good as when you're on foot. Neither the missiles nor the machine gun have a good sense of impact, so it's never satisfying. Also, what is Q doing in the middle of a random forest behind enemy lines? Wei Ling, the badass Chinese counterpart to Bond, played in the movie by Michelle Yeoh, is also playable in the penultimate level, which in theory should add a much needed touch of variety. But in practice, she plays exactly like Bond, and that is such a shame. Because in the movie she's a martial arts expert who kicks and punches her way through hordes of enemies. Making her more hand-to-hand combat focused would have not only been more on character, but also a breath of fresh air for the game. They definitely took being Bond sequel a bit too literally. Not only that, but they also turned the Saigon sequence from the movie, which includes what has to be the best motorcycle chase in any movie I've seen, into a boring on-foot maze that's incredibly hard to find your way through. Just why? Ultimately, Tomorrow Never Dies feels like a hodgepodge of missed opportunities that never really clicked to form an enjoyable adventure from beginning to end. And that being said, I actually had more fun with it than with GoldenEye. Let me explain. Yes, this is definitely uglier to look at than Rare's and Nintendo's take on Bond. Turning corners is a bit of a nightmare. Many choices feel arbitrary, like what is this suitcase with a villain's plan doing in the middle of a newspaper factory? And the final level is almost unplayable due to frame rate issues. There's nothing iconic about it, and it's overall a lesser effort. That is all true, but that doesn't mean there isn't fun to be had. The shooting, while archaic and slow-moving, has an old-school arcade feel that can be addictive under the right circumstances. And if it had a score system, I could have seen myself coming back to get higher scores in a new playthrough. The music is almost as good as GoldenEye's, and the whole package doesn't overstay its welcome. It was over just before all the bad things really got under my skin, and just before I got bored of all the good parts. I found it less frustrating to play than GoldenEye, and at many points had a genuinely good time. In the end, does finally finishing live up to the expectations? Not really. It's not like I rediscovered some hidden gem. Mostly I just like the vibe of it all. Like I said, this is a very specific period for Bond that I've always been drawn to. So even if I wouldn't call this a great or even a good game, it checks enough boxes for me that I could see myself coming back to it years down the line to reminisce about that period of my childhood again and have a decent enough time doing it.
This should punch up my headlines for tomorrow.
I think your story's over, Elliot.
Far from it, you ignorant fool. You see, I've set this boat to self-destruct in 3 minutes. You'll never escape in time. Tomorrow never dies.
Sayonara.
And that's it for this video. If you want to hear more of my nonsense, do hit that subscribe button and like it as well. I'll see you next time.